Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm no Dave Letterman, but my next guest truly needs no introduction. He's someone whose career has spanned VeggieTales to best-selling historical biographies to several years as the voice of BreakPoint alongside my boss, John Stonestreet, to the host of a daily program on the Salem Network named in what I can only describe as a shameless expression of ego after himself. Eric Metaxas is best known as the author of Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, but more recently for his books 7 Men and the Secret of Their Greatness and 7 Women and the Secret of Their Greatness, which profile the lives of especially influential and remarkable people throughout history, particularly Christians. He's just written a new book called 7 More Men, and you can guess what that's about. That's what we want to talk today about on the BreakPoint podcast. Eric, thanks so much for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's my pleasure to be here. I want you to know I invested in a brand new wig. This is real hair. And the wig adhesive is not working the way it's supposed to. So I feel uncomfortable because I feel like it's going to move. So I just want to warn the audience, anything can happen.
Is that genuine musk ox hair, Eric?
No. This is horse hair.
Okay,
actually,
gotcha.
I'll be honest with you. The wig, it's been in the family for years. I just had it dry cleaned. Have we confused people enough yet?
Has it been on any female relatives?
I got to tell you. Yeah, exactly. No, I'm thrilled to be here. When you say John Stonestreet is your boss, I just realized you look beaten down, brother. I want to pray for you after this is over.
I appreciate the prayers, Eric. I really do. It's a rough ride, but it's got to be done.
He's a monster. Let's be honest. Okay. All right.
Well, Eric, for those of us who haven't, or for those who haven't read the book, I did actually read the book. I finished it last night. I'm going to ask the question you actually answer in your preface, which is why these 7? How did you pick them?
Well, the first thing to say is, before I say that, I really have to say why I wrote the book. We live in a culture, at least since I've been a kid, really, that no longer lifts up godly heroes, no longer lifts up heroes of the kind we used to live up as examples and models. We don't do that very well. And even the church has failed to do that. Sometimes we only talk about biblical heroes. And there was a time, really, when we understood that there were people whose lives could serve as models. They were never perfect unless they were Jesus. But it was important. Plutarch's lives, going back, 2,000 years ago, it was always important in the West to hold up models of heroism and dignity and nobility and faith and courage. And in recent decades, we haven't done that so much. And the funny thing is, Shane, that I never set out to write about heroes, but the Lord led me to write my Wilberforce book. Just kind of so happened that I wrote this book on Wilberforce, and then people said, who are you going to write about next? And it ended up being the Bonhoeffer book. And that kind of opened up my career in a way that made me think about, why is God calling me to write about these great people? And I began to see the value was that we desperately need these heroes. And so since I couldn't write, big biographies about all these people whose lives are so amazing, I came up with this idea to write 7 men, since, people are willing to read a chapter instead of a whole book. And then, of course, 7 women. And so that's the long way of saying that there's no objective reason for choosing these people. There are so many others. If I could, I would write many, many more volumes. So this is really just my subjective take on who are 7 men whose lives I would want to emulate or would want to recommend as worthy of emulation. And the only qualification for them to be in this book is that they couldn't be in the first book, 7 Men, and they couldn't be alive. I will not write about living people. You'll notice that Billy Graham is in this book, but he wasn't in the previous book because I won't write about somebody who's alive. In the first book, Chuck Colson was not supposed to be in that book, but he was on his deathbed when I was writing the book, and I realized that I did want to write about him. And when he passed away, I made him the 7th man in the book. And of course, people listening to BreakPoint know who Chuck Colson is. But I thought there are a lot of young people who don't know what an amazing man he was. So he's the 7th man in my 7 men. So 7 More Men just takes off from there. I just thought, who are the people that I would have liked to include in 7 Men and couldn't? Obviously, Billy Graham, when he died, I knew he would be in this book. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, another heroic figure. These are figures who were all Christians and who all evidenced in their lives a number of qualities that I think are worthy of emulation. And as I say, I put them out there not just because I want people to be inspired, although that's the main reason. We need inspiration, we need heroes, as I've been saying, but also because sometimes, because we live in a really secular culture, we don't hear the stories of certain people. And there are a number of stories in here I thought to myself, it's insane that everybody in America, doesn't know the story of George Whitfield. I mean, right. It's like not knowing about George Washington, and a lot of people don't know the real story of George Washington, which is why I put him in my book, Seven Men. But George Whitfield's story is about as central to the United States of America, literally, as anyone's. So I said, I've got to write about him. I talked about him in my book, If You Can Keep It. But, a lot of people don't know about that book. And I thought, man, this guy's story is insane. It's crazy, beautiful, heroic, inspiring. So I had to put him in there. There are a number of people like that. Like I just feel an urgency to communicate to anybody I can the story, because I'm convinced that once you know that story, it will change you and you'll want to tell it to others. So that's the long answer to your question. If you prefer the short question, I can give that later.
Well, I already gave you the short question. You just gave me the long answer.
No, that's what I meant to say. That's the long answer.
Well, Eric, I mean, these aren't the second stringers by any means, right? These aren't like the guys who were left over from your last list and then you just stuck them in this book. They're on par with the first list.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's what I'm saying is like there's so many whose stories are worthy of telling, worthy of emulating. And you know what, Shane, the problem for me is who do I not put in? That's the problem, because there really are innumerable stories. And I think I say it in the preface to this book or in the preface to the first Seven Men book. There are people around us, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, coaches, teachers, whoever it is, who have lived lives worthy of being in a book like this. So there are many. I just thought, let me just pick 7 from history, who I think should be well known by everyone. But yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of it, is that this is not meant to make us feel like, gee, I wish I could be like that, but I guess I can't be as great as that guy. On the contrary, it's to inspire us to be who the Lord wants us to be individually. If we obey him, we will live lives as great as any of these people. They may not make it into a book, but who cares, frankly? The point is that, we're to do what God calls us to do.
Well, it seems like a lot of them were sort of Frodo figures, or Bilbo figures. They were called out of ordinary circumstances. Sometimes you even say extraordinarily ordinary circumstances, like George Washington Carver. And yet they went down in the annals of history because of how they responded to the circumstances they were given. Or Sergeant York, where, this guy is a conscientious objector to war who wrestles and wrestles and wrestles with this question of, committing violence against other human beings, is finally convinced from the scriptures and then goes to the front lines and finds himself using his Tennessee marksmanship skills to take out a bunch of Germans in machine gun nests. And then next thing you know, he's the most famous soldier of the war. Yeah.
Now, because you read the book recently, you literally know more about it than I do. This is what happens to me when I write a book. I write it and then I forget all about it. And then people start asking me questions. I was like, I don't know. I have to really think. I have to think. But actually, the story of Sergeant York is another one that, if you were living in the 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, everybody knew who Sergeant Alvin York was.
Right.
Because World War I was recent enough, and Gary Cooper is the star of a film playing the famous Sergeant York. Everybody knew. Now people don't. And I thought, he's somebody that you don't want him to slip away from history. Same thing with Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I'll talk about him in a minute. But there's certain people that, if I could grab any 25-year-old and say, do you know who Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is? Every 35-year-old, or whatever, probably they won't know. And I'll say, okay, stop. You need to know. This is like, you can't give me the story like, well, I was born in da-da-da. I mean, look, you know who Lincoln is, right? You know who Jesus is. You don't say like, hey, I wasn't born then. There are certain people to be conversant in Western civilization and in the values and in the history of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. You have to know who these people are. Now, Sergeant York doesn't quite rise to the level of Solzhenitsyn, but he has a lesson, particularly for evangelicals. And I have to say, I find this funny because I didn't write about him because of this, but in the course of writing about him, it dawned on me that this is really a story for many evangelicals. They need to hear this. And here's what I'm talking about. Here's a guy who's like a big sinner, you know. He has a big salvation experience. He's kind of a simple guy. And like a lot of people, he's kind of all in for Jesus, like in a crazy young man's kind of way, right? And there's a big upside to that and a big downside. The downside is sometimes our zeal makes us think we know things that we don't. And for evangelicals specifically, one of the great temptations is to so focus on Scripture that you focus on individual scriptures at the expense of the whole counsel of Scripture, right? So this happens today when people say about how can you be for Trump's immigration, or how can you be for a wall, or how can you be, because the Scripture clearly says, you know, we're supposed to treat the alien, and like they pick out a scripture as though that's all God ever said on the subject. And you think, well, it's a little more complicated than that.
And the scripture Sergeant York fixated on was "Thou shalt not kill," which of course,
that's what I was going to say,
is a mistranslation, but still.
Well, I mean, so you got two things there, right? So this is classic. He says, "Thou shalt not kill." Doesn't really say that. It really says that, you know, that thou shalt do no murder. Okay, when you go to war, you're not murdering the enemy. You may be killing them, but that's not murder. Christians, you know, since we've had the just war theory and believers in the God of the Bible way before that, have always made a distinction that, you know, there's killing and there's killing. And so when David kills Goliath, you know, they don't say, well, that's before he became a Christian, then he got saved, and then he repented, apologized to Goliath's family. No, we celebrate that, right? So it's a classic example of somebody who is so on fire for God that he loses the ability to think rationally. I mean, that's really a contradiction, of course, you know, because God would never lead us to that, but it sort of becomes emotional and it becomes intense and passionate. So he focuses on this. And another reason, of course, that it kind of gets to me is that I have given like probably hundreds of speeches on Bonhoeffer, and I've gotten the question over and over, how can a man of God get involved in a plot to murder the Fuhrer? Right? And I say, hold on a second. It wasn't murder. It's a war. So we would think of it differently. And also, what does it matter if he's a man of God? Who cares? If you're a Christian man, you're a man of God. So why? Because he's a pastor, he can't do that dirty stuff, but you can enter the army and you can do that. Like, let's think clearly. And the story of Sergeant York forces us to think clearly and forces us to think, what does the Bible actually say? Not what does that verse say? Forget about that verse. What does the whole Bible say? Because we understand that tons of people love to take Scripture out of context. So for me, it's like the Sergeant York thing is like the classic example of that tendency. It's like a good tendency that goes wrong.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with Eric Metaxas. I want to remind you that registration is open for our upcoming virtual event, Truth, Love, Together. We have an absolutely outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers like Os Guinness, Johnny Erickson Tata, Sean McDowell, Dr. John Lennox, and many, many more. And we'll also be presenting our annual William Wilberforce Award to a truly heroic man, Pastor Bob Fu, fondly known as the pastor of China's Underground Railroad and founder of China Aid. And folks, this event is absolutely free. It's ideal for families, small groups, and of course, for individuals. All you have to do is come to wilberforceweekend.org. That's wilberforceweekend.org. A lot of the men you write about, Eric, are preachers this time around. I'm thinking of Luther and Whitfield and Booth and Graham. Was that a conscious decision to include so many men?
No, that was like an error. I mean, it's like one of these things where like you're trying to kind of balance things out. And in this case, I wasn't able to balance it as effectively as I wanted. There was no way I was not going to put Billy Graham in, but there was also no way I was not going to put in George Whitfield. And the fact that they're both huge evangelists, separated by 250 years, 200 years, I guess. Yeah, 200, whatever. Like it just kind of ended up that way. But also, I guess, because in a funny way, Shane, this forces us to think about what does it mean to be a preacher. It's kind of like when we talk about what does it mean to be a man of God. Bonhoeffer, was he a preacher? Yeah, he preached. Yes, he was ordained. But who cares? Everybody who is born again, everybody who accepts Jesus of Nazareth as Lord, everyone who believes as a believing Christian is equal in God's sight, right? In other words, we're supposed to all look inward and say, Lord, speak to my heart. Tell me what you want me to do with my life. And so we all become preachers. We all become ministers. The question is only, what are the details? I wouldn't say that Wilberforce was not a minister of the gospel, but officially he was a politician.
Right.
I wouldn't say that Bonhoeffer was only a preacher. He preached, but he also got involved in German military intelligence. He also was an academic theologian. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that none of us is called to just do one thing at the expense of other things. We're all called to live out our lives in obedience to God and in a response to his calling on our lives. So when we look at somebody like General Booth, right, we say, well, he preached. But you could also say, well, no, he was a social reformer who preached. You could say the same thing about Wilberforce. He was a social reformer who happened to be a politician, who happened to preach and pray. And then you look at Luther and you say, what was that guy? Well, that guy was a monk. He was a student of Scripture. He was a scholar. He was a reformer. He was a preacher. He was a martyr. He was a husband. He was a father. So I think that it's important for us to understand that God is no respecter of persons, that we should never think, well, he's an evangelist, but I'm just a businessman. That's not God. That's not what the Scripture says.
My guest today is Eric Metaxas. We're talking about his new book, 7 More Men, here on the BreakPoint podcast. Eric, let's talk for a minute about George Whitfield, who's often described as kind of America's spiritual founding father. You make the case that this guy not only helped spark the First Great Awakening, so in a religious capacity, he's acting as a preacher here, a minister of the gospel, but also laid the groundwork for American independence through his preaching in a very sort of subconscious way for the nation. How did that happen? What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, if there's anybody in the world who you could describe as just a preacher or just an evangelist, George Whitfield is the dude. I always joke around that he makes Billy Graham and the Apostle Paul look like lazy agnostics in comparison, right? Like he was a sawed-off maniac preacher. He did nothing but preach and probably died early because he wouldn't shut up a little bit. Like he preached 4 sermons a day for decades. I mean, it's crazy. He was just, some people are just anointed and called by God. And this is a man who, you know, as a teenager, he studied acting. He wanted to be an actor. He had theatrical skills. So when he, at, you know, age 20 or whatever it was, starts preaching, people think, wow, who is this? What is this? We've not seen this in our boring Church of England services where we get a little, you know, mealy-mouthed something, homily. This guy is anointed. This guy is talented. This guy has a voice that he can project and that he can twist and bend in ways that move people to tears. And you realize if ever anybody was created to preach and to evangelize, this man was. So he was, just for that, you have to just take your hat off to him and say, oh my goodness, what a life, what a life. But as you just said, and this is what makes him particularly interesting, like Martin Luther, when you really grab a hold of what we call the gospel, the good news, it is as Jesus says in John with the woman at the well, it's a fountain that never stops flowing. It never ceases. It's never done. And so through history, you see that as the gospel is understood and preached, it keeps leading to greater and greater freedoms of every kind. So that Luther, obviously the first man in this new book, 7 More Men, Luther didn't intend to begin a reformation. He didn't intend to kick off the beginnings of what we think of as religious liberty.
Right.
But that's just what the gospel of Jesus does. It's like the leaven that goes through the whole loaf. You can't stop it. Eventually in history, it goes everywhere. Eventually it abolishes slavery. It doesn't do that instantly. It takes time. But once you begin to understand it, so in the story of Whitfield, all he thinks he's doing is preaching the gospel. Be born again, have a personal relationship with Jesus. There were a lot of people that they said, well, I'm Christians because I'm not a Jew, I'm not an atheist, I'm not a Turk Muslim, so I guess I'm a Christian and I go to the church and I was baptized. And he says, no, you need to have a personal relationship. Well, you kind of think, why did it take him, into the 18th century to preach that? That's something that we had in the first century, but these things kind of get lost in history. So he's preaching this personal relationship with Jesus, which we today understand as, very clear, very necessary if you really want to be a Christian, to have this direct relationship to God. But when he does it, what he's doing, of course, this is what the gospel does, is it upends many things inadvertently, or I should say, in the case of God, advertently. But it's not like he wanted to be a social reformer. But if you're preaching to people that you have a direct relationship to God and God is no respecter of persons, then it kind of follows that the king and the governor and the magistrate and everyone is equal, because we all have a direct relationship to God. We all answer directly to God. So it has this egalitarian quality to it that suddenly makes all these colonials think, well, if that's true, then I don't have to go to that church. I can go to a church where they really are preaching the gospel. I have freedom to worship where I want to worship. I answer to God. Well, that's kind of a revolutionary idea, even in the colonies, where they would, they had come here because they're being persecuted in England, and now suddenly they are persecuting people who aren't thinking the way they do, and they're breaking off and stuff like that. So he really is kind of riding on the back of that as he's preaching, and it leads to this cultural awakening in the colonies that Americans see something for the first time that hadn't really been seen, that we're all free because we are all obligated to God directly. Real freedom is freedom to look to the Lord directly and to do what he tells us to do, even if it goes against what the king or the magistrate does. So it leads to it kind of encourages the self-government that was already happening here in the colonies, and leads people to dare to think, well, if the gospel says I'm free, who's the king to tell me different? In other words, unless he is saying what the gospel says, I have to listen to God before I listen to him, just as Daniel would say, I'm going to listen to God before I'm going to listen to Nebuchadnezzar. Or, suddenly you begin to see all through Scripture, yeah, this applies. And there's just no question that he meaning George Whitfield, became like a saint to the colonists. I mean, he became the celebrity. He sort of represented in himself, imagine, an evangelist, the spirit of America, the spirit of self-government, which I argue flows right out of the Scripture, that the Scripture wants us ultimately to be free politically, just as he wants slavery to end. He wants all these things to happen. And, there is no more central figure in that than George Whitfield. And, I give examples in that chapter, but yeah, I mean, he's as important to the founding of America as George Washington.
Well, as a Presbyterian, I'm particularly fascinated by the religious connections with the American Revolution, because it was, famously called the Presbyterian Parsons Revolt at one point. And you can see even the influence of a Scottish polity in the way that our government is put together.
Well, that's the thing that you understand that I really don't. In other words, I'm not going to pretend I understand everything. I know a little bit about that, seriously. But yes, it's of course more complicated than I've just said. But it is fascinating. The more you know, the more fascinating it becomes.
Well, all these men are worthy of discussion, Eric, but there's just one more I want to mention here, and that's Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. How did an avowed communist youth and atheist become the single most influential critic of communism in the 20th century, and a devout Orthodox Christian?
Well, the short answer to that is, please read that chapter in my book, because I can never do justice to Solzhenitsyn. But look, there's no explanation for these things except God, because this man was persecuted horribly. He was on board with this communist agenda, had kind of left behind the Orthodox Christianity of his youth, of his family, and is on board. And then in a letter kind of cracks a joke about Stalin, and simply because of that is, sent to Siberia, hard labor, the Gulag, just horrors upon horrors. I had the privilege actually on my radio program of interviewing his son, Ignat Solzhenitsyn, And I encourage people, if you go to YouTube to the Eric Metaxas show, that conversation explains a lot that I can't explain in my chapter on him. But this is a man who...
We'll link to that in the show notes, by the way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's just the Eric Metaxas show on YouTube. But Ignat Solzhenitsyn fills in stuff that I couldn't put in the chapter. But I guess the point is that Solzhenitsyn, first of all, was a genius and a man of such courage that once he gets out of... He comes to faith. Actually, I've got to say this. It's Chuck Colson. It's because of Chuck Colson. Maybe in 1990, I read Chuck's book, Loving God. And the first chapter, he talks about Solzhenitsyn's conversion. It blew my mind and kind of made me always want to know more about Solzhenitsyn. And then, so Solzhenitsyn comes out and ultimately becomes a heroic voice against communism from within communism. I mean, you want to talk about guts. And so he writes The Gulag Archipelago, one of the greatest books of the century in history, and reveals with his pen the evil of this atheist communist dictatorship under which he suffered and in which he lived. And in a funny way, that alone, you could say that was the piece that tips over Soviet communism, so that today we say, hey, it's gone. It's in the dustbin of history, the ash heap of history. And he gave a speech in 1978 at the Harvard graduation. They didn't know what they were getting in for.
Right.
They were in for it. And he gave this famous speech in the rain, 2 hours in Russian, with the translation and stuff. And it was a thundering Philippic against the West, against us. In other words, here he comes out of that to this, but then says, and you are, by forgetting God, you're going in the same direction. Be warned. He was a prophet. He was a prophet. And I've argued with my friend Hugh Hewitt about this, that what he said was right, and it's coming to pass right now. And so we would do well to attend to Solzhenitsyn as a prophet, because he speaks to where we are this minute in our culture.
Well, if you walk in, you walk into the Heritage Foundation lobby and you see all this stuff about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and he's seen there as a political figure, and he is a political figure. He's this commentator on the evils of communism. But then, as you mentioned, Eric, when he comes to the United States, he starts critiquing our cultural decadence. He starts critiquing our descent into mere entertainment and diversion and pleasures without actually pursuing something truly good, truly beautiful. And he does this out of a place of having experienced grave evil. He knows, because he's seen the blackest pits of despair, that there has to be something brighter than mere consumerism and capitalism. And that's what makes him such a powerful social critic.
That's it. So I'm really thrilled that I got to put his story in this book. People need to know who he was and what he did.
Well, he's also one of those intellectuals that conservatives like to talk about. And I think a lot of people hear the name and they go, oh yeah, okay, some Russian intellectual. This is not someone that I need to really know about. This is very highbrow stuff, right? And that's not the case at all. And again, that's exactly why I wrote this book, Seven More Men, and the previous books, because I want to make it so that any, 8th grader or 10th grader or anybody who's not a huge reader can read it, can get it, can understand it. This is not like my Luther book or my Bonhoeffer book or my, I'm not being fancy in a literary way. I just want to tell the story clearly, because everybody needs to know the story. You can't say that's for intellectuals or it's not. Believe me, it's a simple story. Well, Eric, I was really blessed by reading Seven More Men. And I have one more question about it, because the title itself and the structure of the book sort of implies that you've intentionally gendered these things, that you've divided them into men and women. Why not seven more people? You suggest, I remember in the opening for Seven Women, rather, that there's actually a reason for this, that the women you list and the men you list in these books, their greatness comes as men, as women. Explain what you mean there.
Well, it's not like I was thinking it through too much in the beginning, but first I just thought we're having a crisis of manhood in our culture. People are really confused. This is before transgender became, the thing. I just thought part of why we're so screwed up is because we can no longer even say to somebody like, hey, be a man, you can't say that. Whatever. Yes, I can. And I just did. And by the way, God's idea is that men need to be men.
Paul's like, act like men. And we go, what?
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing. So I thought, I just want to write a book to inspire young men and men. And then, of course, people said, why don't you write a book on women? And I thought, well, sure, okay. And then when I wrote that, I realized everybody that I am lifting up in this book, Seven Women, is great, specifically somehow because they were a woman, not just in general. It's very interesting. And so it wasn't something that was too intentional, but the most important part of my 7 Men book and the most important part of my 7 Women book is probably the introductions to those books, because I kind of explain this. But it ends up being a central idea, and yet it wasn't something that I was extremely intentional about. It just sort of ended up that way. But I think in retrospect, being countercultural when you're living in a really sick culture is important. And so I think, just the idea of being countercultural, even flippantly, can be a healthy thing. But in this case, it's not merely flippancy.
Folks, Eric Metaxas, the man, the myth, the legend. If you want to pick up a copy of 7 More Men and the secret of their greatness, just come to breakpoint.org and we'll tell you how you can get that. I think you can also grab it at ericmetaxas.com or Amazon. Eric, thanks so much for joining me on the BreakPoint podcast. It's been great.
It's a privilege, and give my love to my friend John Stonestreet.
I sure will. Thanks everyone for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. To get your copy of Eric Metaxas' new book, 7 More Men, come to our online store at breakpoint.org. And remember, come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for next month's Truth, Love, Together virtual event and to hear our outstanding lineup of Christian worldview thinkers. It's completely free and promises to be one of the great worldview gatherings of the year. Again, that's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.